sanctions, blockades, which is usually the typical response of the international community when they want to try to change something. But does it ever work? No, all it does is just strangle the citizens of the country. The elite of the country, no matter what organization they come from, all know how to get around sanctions and blockades, and it's the average person that's strangled to death, and that's what had been happening in Gaza over these last 3.5 years. 1.5 million people living in this tiny little area, this strip of land called the Gaza Strip, 25 miles long and 5 miles wide, and 1.5 million people living in that, one of the most densely populated areas of the world. And yet it had been the decision of the international community that the international community would put a quarantine around it to really strangle the people. And in fact, one of the Israeli ministers said, you know, the people of Gaza should be on a diet. That's okay, on a diet. It's not just the Israeli ministers that talk about stuff like, about harming people in that way. If you look at what our own Secretary of State during the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright, said about the sanctions and the quarantine that the United States and other countries had on Iraq, and was the death of 500,000 children of Iraq, was she concerned about that and the effects of the sanctions? And she said, no, that's what we need to do. But for us as citizens, I think we need to be we need to be standing up to our government when it says that's how we are going to affect change, by strangling the common people of a country. In Gaza, the people had to respond to the less than 10% of the normal amount of materials and food that are needed to sustain a population of 1.5 million people. Less than 10% of that amount was being allowed in by the Israelis and the Egyptians. And as you probably have seen on in many documentaries and in many articles, the way the Palestinians in Gaza got around this was by digging tunnels. Hundreds of tunnels that were dug under the Egyptian border, hundreds of them, in broad daylight. It's not that they're hiding anything. I've been to those tunnels. I've seen the tents that are above the tunnel openings. I've met and talked with the young men that the only jobs there are for the young men of Gaza are to be the tunnel diggers, where they get paid maybe $25 a day. A huge amount in Gaza, a huge amount. But it's a very dangerous job, and many young men are killed when the tunnels collapse, when the Egyptians decide to fire tear gas into the tunnels, and they're suffocated and they die, when gasoline lines that are used to bring gasoline into Gaza, when they rupture and there are young kids under there, or when they happen to bump up against an electric wire that's putting light in through those tunnels and they get electrocuted. How do they, and this is the way they have to get in food and merchandise because of the international blockade that our government is a major part of. So there have been citizens around the world who have been saying, we the citizens have to force our governments to change these policies. And our taking groups in, 7 groups that we took in following the attack in Gaza in January of 2009, that was a way to break the land blockade. And not all groups got to go in. In fact, most groups that wanted to go into Gaza to see the damage there were not allowed in by the Egyptians. But for some reason, we were able to get 7 different groups, to include the parents of Rachel Corrie, this young American woman who had been run over by a D9 bulldozer in the town of Rafah, Gaza, 7 years ago in March of 2003. We took her parents in. We took many members of the Jewish faith in who wanted to go in and see what had happened, because some of the loudest opponents of the Israeli policies are members of the Jewish faith who say that is not what our faith is about, is what the Israeli government is doing. So taking in Jewish people to be there, to take in people from all over the world. We had, this kind of culminated, the land part of this culminated in December of 2009 with what we call the Gaza Freedom March, where 1,350 people from 44 countries signed up to go to Gaza to march in solidarity with the people of Gaza. Unfortunately, the Egyptian government wouldn't let us go. But what happened in Egypt, when you have 1,300 activists from all over the world who are used to challenging their own government, and they come to Egypt, and even though it's a very authoritative government that says you can't get more than 6 people together at one time, well, these activists didn't listen to the Egyptian government at all. And indeed, there were vigils, demonstrations, there were all hunger strikes that were held, never before really seen in Egypt. During the time that we were taking land groups into Gaza, there was another group of people that started in 2008. They were starting to challenge the naval blockade of Gaza, and this was a group called the Free Gaza Boat Movement. And starting in the summer of 2008, they were taking small boats, taking them from Cyprus and running them all the way to Gaza to see if they could get in to break this siege. And in fact, the first 5 ships were allowed in. The Israeli military allowed the first 5 ships to go into the Gaza City harbor, the first time in something like 43 years that a ship from an international port had been able to land in Gaza City. But then following the attack of the Israelis on Gaza in December and January, the Israeli government took a different tack, that they then started boarding forcefully every one of the next 3 boats, and the last one of the boats that came in June of 2009 was actually rammed by an Israeli boat, almost sunk. And on board that boat was Maureen Maguire, a Nobel Peace Laureate. On board was also a former U.S. Congresswoman, Cynthia McKinney. And you may have read about them. They stayed in jail in an Israeli prison for 10 days after the ship was almost sunk and all passengers brought to Israel. Well, with the Israeli choice of using force to stop these boats, the Free Gaza movement said, wait, we've got to rethink this. One boat against the Israeli Navy is never going to make it into Gaza. And actually, it was not getting a lot of publicity about the siege that was going on in Gaza. So they started thinking about what else could we do. And over time, they decided, why don't we see if there's enough interest in the international community that we could have a flotilla, not just 1 boat or 2 boats, but how about a lot of boats? And maybe that would get the attention of the world. And so that's how the idea of the Gaza flotilla started. And indeed, there were 8 boats that started out to be a part of this flotilla in May of this year, just a month ago. 8 boats, 4 passenger boats and 4 cargo ships. The cargo ships carrying 10,000 tons of construction materials to help repair housing that had never been touched because there were no repair materials in Gaza. Houses that had been blown apart 18 months before were still lying in rubble. So prefabricated buildings were being brought in. Medical supplies for the hospitals that have never been fully re-equipped after the attack in 2008 and 2009. So the ships were laden with all sorts of materials that were for the people of Gaza. But as important as the material on the ship were the people that were on board the passenger ships, because that was the sign of solidarity, of people to people, that there were 750 people from something like 40 nations that were willing to go to Athens, to Crete, to Istanbul, to Cyprus, to Ireland, to get on these ships and then come down, slowly making their way into the Mediterranean, and then forming a flotilla and heading for Gaza. I was on board 3 of the ships actually. The Challenger 2, I initially was on a small boat about 40 feet long, carrying 18 passengers. It and its companion ship, the Challenger 1, left Crete, Greece, to head down to the meeting place of all of the flotilla, which was just off the western side of Cyprus. The 2 Challenger boats, all funded by the Free Gaza boat movement, developed steering problems 12 hours out of Crete. At about the same time, the steering mechanisms gave out on both of the ships. A little suspicious,